We're ready anytime you are.
Okay. Well, we might as well, we'll start. I'd like to call it's 12 o'clock on my computer. I'd like to call the May 24th Finance Committee meeting to order. Online, we have Member Wilson, Member Jacobs, and did you say that Member Higgins is here too?
Not yet.
Not yet. In the room, you're in the room with a tremendous amount of support staff, Dr. Bishop, Dr. Bryant, and I appreciate all of your presence. So we had a little bit of clarification of today's agenda. I think we'll get to the bond within new business. But first, we can move to the first item, which is the audit plan topic. So this is just a quick review
Do you want me to?
of what we discussed at the last finance committee meeting. And Member Jacobs and I drafted, Jim Anderson drafted.
I think all of us drafted one, but I think
We collectively, we have a better product collectively than there was individually. And this will be coming from the superintendent's office to the board, I guess, pending the committee's approval. And so this is a review of what we'll be doing over the coming school year and why, I guess. Hold a second, so. Are there any questions from board members online?
Madam Chair, this is Member Jacobs. Could I speak just briefly?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. I just wanted to express appreciation for finance staff and you, Madam Chair, for hearing out the idea of having a formal audit plan that goes to the committee and then goes to the full board for adoption approval. I think it generates buy-in and formalizes the process, creates a record for next year. And so all just a bunch of really good housekeeping items. And so I'm excited to have this, and I hope the committee supports sending it to the full board. Thank you.
Great. I'm just gonna, Katie, if you could scroll down just to recap. So over the summer, the audit team will review the student nutrition warehouse inventory controls. In the fall, it will be an audit of travel, and in the winter of sort of the 2022-2023 fixed asset inventory. And if there are no further questions, I guess, I'll ask the finance committee to vote on this if we're going to informally take a finance committee, but we haven't done this before for the past year. So Member Wilson, do you support sending this on to the full board?
I do.
Okay. I support sending it on, and we don't have Member Higgins, but that's 2 out of 3. So with that, I'd say thank you to the finance team, and we can probably move to the second item on the agenda, which is that looks like our SRO update.
So a week ago, last Friday, the Assembly did override the mayor's veto. We haven't seen anything come out of the CFO's shop or Office of Management and Budget at municipal level indicating that they were going to use any other approved budget other than what we believe was the budget first quarter revision, which is what the Assembly overrode. So I think in terms of the SROs, just to be really clear, when we put 2.3 million in our budget, it covered July through December plus January through June next year. January through June next year is a different fiscal year for the city because their fiscal year goes from January to December. So it does appear that from 1 July to 31 December, we have about 1.15 million that at some future date, we can either make a decision and put it in the general fund in preparation for fiscal year 24, or some other some other need. And just to be clear, we have a lot of things that we put in our budget where we say we're going to spend $2.5 million for utilities. Just because the budget says $2.5 million will be spent for utilities, we don't actually spend $2.5 million if the actual invoices are $2 million. And we don't go back to the board for that. It just rolls into the fund balance. Now, if it was the opposite effect and it was double, then we make, we'd have to budget transfer potentially funding, and then we would come to the board. So it doesn't require a memo at this point. In fact, frankly, we may need a budget revision anyway if all of the legislative funds that are being approved or that got approved by the Senate and the House, if the mayor leaves or the governor leaves all of them in, we may have to come back for another budget revision later in the summer, and we'd probably do that in the first board meeting in August, which would be, I think, the 3rd of August, Katie? That's our first
I believe it is, yeah.
board meeting of next year. So if there was a desire to move the funds, that would be an opportune time to go ahead and clean up the budget as part of a revision anyway. Although, I mean, you certainly, second, okay, 2nd of August. So that's kind of where we stand. I think most people are in agreement that the Assembly's override, because they used, the mayor's team and the Assembly used the same revenue, which was not the case last November, December, where the mayor's revenue was different than what the Assembly used. But if you use the same revenue, and they did, then there shouldn't be any problems as a result.
Just to let you know that President Bellamy is joined online.
Okay, thank you. And Member Higgins has come into the room as well, for the record. Are there any board member questions for Mr. Anderson about the state of our SRO funding and the idea of looking for budget revisions in August? Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So question first for Mr. Anderson. If as it stands right now, if the district were to receive a bill or some formal request from the municipality for any portion of the school resource officer funding, would the district comply and facilitate payments? And would the board be notified if that happened?
To the chair, to Member Jacobs, that the first thing I would do would be to call OMB and the CFO and see where the confusion was. The second step would be, if they decided to use a different budget, I would probably consult legal and get a formal legal opinion. And then naturally I would brief the superintendent and then the board, but we would not pay it. I mean, there's no legitimate mechanism for the muni to send us an invoice for SROs at this time. So Andy and I would not just pay it, and we would go through whatever the next steps would be. And I would suspect the board would engage the Assembly as well, would be my guess. But again, since they used the exact same revenue forecast, which was not the case last winter, I can't imagine that there's a legal mechanism for them to ignore components of what was an override on a lot of different issues.
Member Jacobs, did you have a follow-up question or comment?
Yeah, no, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Anderson, I appreciate the clarification. Sounds like the board would be notified if anything changes, which is helpful. The other thing that I know President Bellamy and I both articulated pretty clearly to the Anchorage Assembly is that we pledged if we were given these funds back where we didn't have to appropriate them for the purpose of paying for the Anchorage Police Department, that we would have a conversation as to how those would be used to support classroom work and student outcomes. And so to me, not taking action doesn't hold up our end of the bargain. And so, Madam Chair, I know I'd been in contact with you about a memo to formally claw back that funding, remove that line item from the budget, which I think we tentatively agreed would be best saved in general fund balance for the administration to consider how to best use that in supporting classroom work. I haven't heard anything which I think either one deters that course of action, or two makes that any less viable of a path forward, especially given what we've clearly articulated to our partners on the Assembly. So that's where my preference is, but I'm speaking as a member who isn't on the committee. So thank you.
To the chair, to Member Jacobs, I think the advantage of waiting until the 2nd of August is we'll see how many kids have actually registered for school. We'll have a little bit more comfortable feel, because we may have to do a budget revision anyway, and we could roll all of them into one. But we'll have a better feel as to how many kids are going to show up. When Bill Pop briefed the state of the city a couple months ago, he said that Anchorage had lost another 1,800 jobs more than, or 1,800 residents more than what moved into Anchorage. So anytime you hear those numbers and you can't get the information on whether they had dependent students or not, you never really know. Did they leave part of the family here where the kids would move during the summer and remake the family whole again? We really couldn't get that kind of information. We haven't seen transfers out of the district yet. Those generally happen in the month of June and July, where Maria Shablis starts seeing all of the records requests to move records. Plus we'll have the summer online enrollment in July. So, we knew 2 years, 3 years ago in the beginning of August that we were not going to meet our numbers, and we used it based off the number of records transferred out plus the enrollment. For Title I schools, enrollment specifically at elementary school continues to grow throughout the first 4 weeks of school, but we have enough historical data that we can get reasonably close, in that August timeframe. So, I think we have time for a vote in that decision.
Member Jacobs, yes.
Madam Chair, thank you for your grace. Just one last follow-up. Mr. Anderson, I agree in that how we use the funding, waiting until August, that seems to be a reasonable course of action there. I think the one thing that we know for certain at this point is that 2.3 million can go somewhere else. And so for me, it's two separate questions. Number one, is there a benefit for it sitting in the budget? Until August, I don't see that benefit. The other half of the question is very relevant, and I agree with you wholeheartedly that waiting until early fall as to get those data points as to how to move forward seems very reasonable. And so that's still where my preference is, but I appreciate the information and your clarification as always. Thank you.
Member Higgins or Member Wilson or Member Bellamy, did anybody have any follow-up questions?
No, I would just make the comment, the SRO funds can't be reallocated to other locations anyway, prior to that without the board involvement. So there really isn't any, basically it's in reserves, even without being officially in reserves, okay? It's not something that is going to be spent. So from my standpoint, waiting till August makes sense.
That would be correct. Okay. Member Wilson, Member Bellamy.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Madam Chair. Member Jacobs and I and Dr. Bishop had a conversation earlier. And to be honest, that was before I really focused on the August, waiting to see what the numbers look like. But I agree with Member Higgins that that money is reserved whether we officially point it out or not. And I think the system supports that. So we can have further discussions, between now and August. But right now, I'm pretty comfortable with the August 2nd date. I'm not on the committee. Well, I guess I am ad hoc, but I don't get to vote. Okay.
And Kelly, I don't have any questions at this time. Thank you.
Okay. I personally feel comfortable. I mean, Member Jacobs, we have a tentative draft, but I feel comfortable waiting until August to address the bigger picture and the question of student enrollment. But I absolutely agree that I'd like to see these funds go towards student learning in a highly effective way, whatever that entails. And I think that would hold up our end of the bargain, in your words. So maybe we can hold on to this conversation and revisit it pending an August conversation.
Okay. Madam Chair, can I ask Member Jacobs a clarifying question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Relative to the memo or the resolution that we talked about earlier. Is that something that you think is, I guess I'm trying to understand why you think that would be the most, that is important to do right now, other than we've already said that where those funds are going to go back to the classroom. Is there another piece of this that I'm missing that supports your recommendation on a memo or a resolution of some kind?
Yeah, through the chair, thank you, President Bellamy. I drafted the memo after asking staff specifically if the absent any action from the board, if staff would make payments using that line item if a bill or statement was received from the municipality, and not notify the board. And the answer I was given was yes. And so in an effort not to an attempt to micromanage staff and not put them in a position to have to take action that isn't consistent with what the assembly did, my desire was to write a memo and then have the board support removing that line item from our budget and then deciding what to do with those funds later. Mr. Anderson earlier clarified that it's his intent, if any requests from the municipality come forward, to utilize any portion of the 2.3 million prior to August, to let the board know and to loop in the superintendent and take other action with municipal finance partners, which is great, reasonable, and different than what I was told. And so that's good news. I continue not to see a downside to taking care of the first half of the process now. And then looking forward to allocating it later. But if the board's preference is to take care of both halves of this equation in August, I don't find that unreasonable. The same as I don't find taking care of that first half of the process and removing that line item now. It's also not unreasonable. I think it's ultimately a preference. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Jacobs. I guess I'd like to ask, maybe just for one last clarification, Member Higgins and Member Wilson, would you like to see the Finance Committee at our next meeting approve a memo rolling 2.3 million into the general fund, or would you like to wait until August?
My preference would be to go ahead and wait till August, because we can then get the recommendation from the administration on where to put those funds to best utilize the education. We can clearly identify for political purposes how we're using that money to help educational outcomes without taking action, without giving new superintendent an opportunity to look at the big financial pictures. This plate's so full. Drinking from a fire hose, I would think, is the best way to describe it. And so this would just be a more appearance type of sake of actions. And I really want to get the recommendation coming in where we can best utilize it. So just putting it in the general fund, it's a statement saying we're putting it, where it should be used. I'd like to, in August, when we identify where the funds are going, then we can take that money, put it directly into that. If there's any questions in regards to the municipality, we can talk about how we put it towards educational outcomes as opposed to just in the general fund. The general fund can be used obviously for operational issues of a variety of things. I'd like to see it dedicated when we do it so that we can say it's tied into education, and you made this possible if it gets to be an issue with the assembly so that we can get the funding next year as well. So I just think it sends a more positive message to say how we're using the message information rather than just a mechanical change in funds that doesn't tell you how we're using it. Makes more sense to me politically, wait till August.
And Member Wilson, just to come back one last time to you as a member of the Finance Committee, how do you feel about that proposal?
I'm comfortable waiting till August as well.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate all the board members' input. That sounds like something to look forward to at the end of the summer, start of the fall. And with that, I think we could briefly pivot to number 3, the legislative update. And it's my understanding we're going to have a much more robust legislative discussion at the June 6th work session.
So I went through all 3 bills, the budget bill, the committee substitute, and the capital bill. And this is just to provide you with, in case you get questions from the community between now and when Heather briefs at work session. Andy, give you an idea of what was in the budget bill. I did go through it several times. I do have a few questions that I have to run down, but you can see in the capital budget, the state approved $100 million, took deeds 1 to end list that was approved in the middle of the winter timeframe. Went through, and these are all the projects that have already been completed in Anchorage School District. In fact, you kind of, in order to be able to create the list, because it's matching, you have to know exactly how much you spent to be able to fill out deeds request list. And you'll see that we have a total of almost $35 million that, assuming it doesn't get vetoed, would come back to us. There was some risk in the last 5 or 6 days. In Juneau, a very senior senator on the Finance Committee wanted to take that and take all of ASD's bond debt reimbursement and put that towards the fort. It ended up not making it through, so felt pretty comfortable that we were able to stay in touch and talk to people the whole time to make this happen. The line item fund of $500,000 for Russian check, I do have to run that down. It sounds like it's money that goes to the city and not us.
Yes.
But I just have to confirm, and the same for the Airport Heights ice rink. I'm not sure where that came from. You can see the bond debt reimbursement for fiscal years 17, 20, 21, and 22. Did I give you, okay, you have the updated one. So fiscal year 17, that money was not funded with bond debt. That was general fund money that the board approved to cover the shortfall when Governor Walker vetoed part of our bond debt. So that one kind of fits in the same category as the 35 million above. That's pretty flexible. I have already reached out to Howard Trickey and his team, and they're going through the wording to find out what our flexibilities are for fiscal years 2021 and 22. I should get that in the next day or two, and I'll get with Dean, confirm that. And the next time we talk this, I will have a little bit more information. I know at the very beginning of this being put into both the House and the Senate Finance Committees, I guess to start with, maybe everyone doesn't know this, we're the only school district in the state that has our own capital plans and our own Fund 3. Everybody else, their Fund 3 and all construction is run by the city or borough. So during initial discussions, when they were talking about it with the folks from Fairbanks and Juneau and Matsu, they all said this money goes back to the cities because they increased taxes after the fact to pay for the bond debt. As it turns out, some of the cities didn't really do that and had the school district eat it. And because they didn't want to increase taxes, and that's our sister district right down the road. So I think there's going to be quite a few legal opinions, depending on the district, that will go out on this, and I'll provide an update. The really interesting one, I thought, and it got thrown in literally in the last 72 hours, was the $750 million that they would set aside to help fund education for fiscal year 24 if the average price of oil stays at $101 per barrel for all of next fiscal year. If it's between 75 and 90, then they wouldn't put any money to forward fund education. So I'm also confirming, but the way I see it after reading it many times, it doesn't mean that there's $750 million more. It's just they're going to prepay education for portions of education for fiscal year 24. So frankly, whether it's 75 to 90 or whether it's 101, it doesn't necessarily mean we get more money in fiscal year 24. So I did want to clarify that because it's
what we'll get.
It's right. It's just what a set aside. So they know they have 3/4 of the money they need to cover education for fiscal year 24. It does though, because there were a lot of discussions. Andy and I briefed the fiscal cliff, I don't know, 24 times plus in Juneau this year. There are a lot of legislators who do understand what's coming, and they're hoping they can set money aside and they also have enough from oil revenue regardless to cover education that it would allow some flexibility for them to, again, BSA is always tough on the first year of a 2-year legislative session. It probably would be one-time money, but we'll see. But that's how I see that particular piece in the bill. The Alaska READS Act, I think almost everyone was following that. The 0.5 ADM for pre-K students also counts toward transportation. So, I think from a financial perspective, not everything else in the act, it certainly was a good thing for us. Of course, you can't count the students that are funded, sped pre-K or stuff like that. You can't count them for ADM, but or title. But still, Dr. Bishop's been working the Alaska READS Act since like the second week on the job as the brand new superintendent with Senator Begich. It's taken 6 years to push it through. So I think a lot of people claimed a pretty big victory on that. So that's what I saw, and I did skip at the top. There is the $57 million outside the formula one-time money.
That's statewide.
That's statewide. For us, it's in the $16-ish million, with another $2 million for a $30 BSA increase. And we'll bring back, that's what may cause us to do a budget revision. And once Andy and I do the math, that would be another one that we would bring up on that very first board meeting in August. And we probably would start reaching out, I would guess, in Board Connect prior to that meeting, just to let people see where we stand so there's no surprise.
Yeah, Member Higgins.
I've got a few questions. On the capital budget, is that where we provided to the legislators a list of things that we would like to see done, and each legislator then gets to be supportive of it in their district? Is that how we?
No,
We had already funded these, so we were set up to get that.
Right,
Well,
but
everyone-
each
Those are the old
legislator
Senate bills
gets
that have
gets
those.
credit for it, so we want to reach out and thank them some way or other.
Not really. This one's different from those.
Okay.
So Tom sends a 1 to N list of all the projects that meet the criteria to be able to even be put on the deed list. And all of the districts do it, you do it every winter. And then it goes, deed goes through and they have a committee that goes through and they prioritize based off how well Tom writes and justifies the urgency of those projects. And then they take all of those and the committee approves it, sends it to the governor signs it. Then it goes back to deed and deed submits that to the legislature as a 1 to N list. So if it's 50 million, you keep going down the list until you get to 50 million. 100 million is the largest we've had in quite a while. And really, I think we got a third of it.
I raise that only because the ones in these individual districts like the thank you letter for supporting my school or something like that. That's why I only raised that. That's outside the finance committee, but it gets to be something that they take,
Oh, that's a good
that
idea.
type of issue.
I can get a list of all of the Anchorage caucus that voted yes for this.
Yeah.
And we
They
could put
voted
that in
no,
Board
tell 'em.
Connect so everyone knows.
Yeah, take them off the.
And I won't put who voted no, because I
Take
don't
them
need to
off.
do that, but I will put who voted yes.
We did that for the reason.
And I know Dina sent something to all the Anchorage caucus about 48 hours and 24 hours prior to the final votes as well.
And I think you were.
And a letter.
And on the supplemental for the bond debt reimbursement, whether or not that has to go towards the backlog, the debt, or whether we can use it differently or all that, that's still being resolved. Is
Yes,
that right?
that's correct.
Right, this is
Okay.
all money the taxpayers have already paid for. So we've already billed the
Yeah,
Anchorage taxpayers for all this.
Except for fiscal year 17, because that was general fund and that wasn't bond money or tax money. Although technically it was. right?
Part of it
general
was
fund.
dedicated to the
Yeah.
fund balance within the debt service fund.
Right, and there was,
It was like 5.8 million or something general fund that we use.
yeah, it just gets to be an interesting one because we get 90,000, of course, we lost 100,000, thing. But if we do that to say, okay, the public didn't support it, so we'll find another way to do it, you got that type of repercussions associated with it.
They're
I
kind of
don't
paying
know.
for it twice then.
It's something to be carefully considered in regards to how we do it, how that might be perceived.
well, the discussions on the House and Senate floor very much were, we know for most districts, they had to go back and put additional taxes the year afterward. And so they assumed, although the language doesn't say that it would have reimbursed the taxpayers. So hypothetically, in that scenario, we would take $81 million and over the course of a couple of years, apply that towards bond debt where Anchorage didn't have to tax property owners. Then there are those who, when you look at the language, who look at it as more flexible for other options. And that's why I'm sure there's a platoon of lawyers in the state right now looking at that, and we'll be working with Dean and
Sounds like we need to wait for the governor.
we need to wait for the governor first before we do anything, because right now, none of this exists.
Yeah.
It's just somewhere in that no person's land between half approved and all the way approved.
If it was next year, it wasn't election year, I think, but never know how it would be, but I think this year was a little different. The pre-K fund, that doesn't dictate how it's spent for pre-K or what approach we take, it's kind of wide open.
It would roll into district funds just like
Yeah.
normal
But dedicated
foundation
for that
formula
purpose,
funding.
but that's fine. Okay, thank you.
I saw that President Bellamy has her hand raised.
Yeah, I was just gonna, thank you, Madam Chair. I was just gonna let the committee know that Member Jacobs and I already also sent a thank you to the Anchorage caucus for several things, actually, including the capital budget. And my other comment was just had to do with thanking everybody for those last minute requests for sending for support, sending letters to our legislators. I really thank you. This year, you guys outdid yourself. So I really, really thank you for that.
It was a busy year. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Anderson, for that really their update. I imagine there'll be more come June 6th. So with that, let's go to, I lost my connection, the last item on the agenda, which is new business, which doesn't spell out, but does include a discussion about the bond. And this was something that I wanted to have at some point, and pleased that there are people in the room that can help us talk about what we understand didn't go well with the bond, and maybe plant the seeds for how we move forward. So that's an open-ended question, and
I can,
maybe
I
after
can
Bishop,
start,
you wanna
and just to share, that when, we have the 6-year approval list, and that is, of course, a dynamic, document. And on that list, and as you know, because we had passed the design money in review, just that is a needed project. And so we have been crystal clear that investment in that area needs to be made. That's one of our facilities. When we create a bond and take that 6-year, we do research and haze, and we reach out, and then we did an early summer, early fall outreach, because we're putting that bond together over the summer, ready to present it to you. Because again, we want it out. We want to get ours to be the first approved in December, so it's the first on the list. And it became crystal clear at that time that the feeling was you got to keep it within debt, because people weren't, feeling it, that they wanted to make a large investment, and that it also came out, which is what we knew, that the unstableness of our enrollment really affected that. So we would need to reduce. So the first bond, as you know, that we shared with some board members had inlet view on it. And then once those results came in, it quickly changed. And we had the second meeting with some board members to say, hey, we have to, and this is Tom and his team coming, meeting with me to share, we have to then adjust this, because we heard loud and clear, and Hayes has helped us out over time of how to do things. We've won bonds quite a bit. So that was where the decision was made to remove it for just this year, because of the impact to the community financially, as well as kind of the feeling of right sizing the district. We did not want to, it was a deliberate action. And I just felt strongly that keeping schools open through Delta and what we were seeing is traumatic. It was like hard. It was hard work. And if we would have put on top of that, oh, and by the way, to invest in new schools, we're going to reduce these too. We just couldn't do that to people. There's so much capacity that we have in our district, and that would have, from community members to just kids and our staff members especially. So we knew, let's put inlet view on hold for 1 year, keep the bond under the debt retirement for major maintenance, because that was the board's focus, and they're writing at that last time a bond had failed, I think in like 15 or something, or spring of 16. And so that was the plan. We went back, and of course we know from there, that's what we did. I mean, just so you know, since then, and we shared with the board, we did another Hayes survey to say, okay, what's it after action? It failed, what do we do? The exact same information that came up on that was the same information that came up, that it just was too big, and we need to, as a community. And I'll let others add, but like that, the detail of there and everything else run by our capital plan, those were some of the discussions that we had and some of the evidence that had come out. And it just altered, and the board, that's the board's job to create that bond and vote on that bond. But our best thinking had been into it from our experience, our research, and the realities of where our district was, and really the pandemic having that influence on it. And I'll turn it over to George to fill in where I left off.
So the other thing too is, having dealt with bonds for quite a few years now between the uni and the school district, when you're looking at $100 million bond, that's pretty hard stuff. When you're looking at $100 million bond without any surety that you're gonna get debt reimbursement. In fact, no debt reimbursement for that, then I gotta tell you, that's even harder. And then when you put on top of that, the economic strain that everybody's going through because of the pandemic, we're still trying to recover from the earthquake and all these other things. All of those things make a difference to the voters. And so it was just way too much, way too much. The other factor that keeps coming up, and I know you've seen it, is that we have excess capacity, as the superintendent just said. And that excess capacity at some point in time is going to bite us in the rear end if we don't deal with it. Because it's going to be harder and harder in the future to get bonds approved, especially if you want to build a new facility, replace one, expand one, whatever that decision is. It's going to be very difficult unless you can show that we're the best stewards that we possibly can with the assets and the money and the facilities that we have. And that would be to reduce some of your infrastructure.
Did any board members, oh, Member Higgins. your
Thank
hand.
you. Yeah, I appreciate that because I know that issue comes up as far as excess. But we also, I'll refer back to the Pike-Casodum study when we looked at it from classroom size and what we would have to do to be adequately funded based upon lawsuits in the lower 48. We don't have that. We do not have excess capacity when you look at the classroom size. It's getting smaller, having to have more staff than where we're at. I don't think that's really the case. It is based upon current funding and based upon classroom sizes the way they are right now, and with reductions in staff and no increase in BSA, I agree. But if we had adequate funding based upon Pike-Casodum, we'd be adding hundreds of teachers. It would change the capacity. So if we lower our capacity with classrooms, then it's going to impact our ability in the future to try to address that if we wanted to go over the issue of, and that was even promoted in the past by former Mayor Begich and others. They say simply file a lawsuit to establish what is adequate funding, because that's a constitutional issue and the courts have ruled on that. So my concern about reducing schools has to do with that issue and how we would be able to deal with it. I remember raising the issue about classroom sizes and bringing it down when I first ran, and the response was, well, we wouldn't have adequate funding. We wouldn't have adequate space anyway to reduce the classroom sizes to where it could be, meet that requirement. So I just want to connect those two a little bit in regards to saying, rather than concede that we're going to have larger classroom sizes in other places in the country because of inadequate funding, I would want to get into a discussion with that first.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond, and I think the Pike-Casodum was done over 10 years ago.
Yep.
And we actually, when you got off the board actually focused on to smart reduction, because it wasn't actually saving money to reduce because a school was a unit. And so we worked with the legislature and at that time, and they actually helped, Jim and I testified to create a hold harmless to close schools, so that because there was no economic incentive outside of capital to close school operationally. So we had done that. But I would say that even over the last 10 years, the research has changed in regard to what is effective and good use, and some of the economics things that member Lessons attended, member Bellamy, and certainly our team. And so there's renewed research in that area that I think if the board wanted to invest in, that you could probably find some things out that fluid use of space, especially since the pandemic has affected that. And so the use of space and the ideas of the space at school have changed since the Pike-Casodum. And so there's a newer way of doing business. And I don't know if you have anything to add with that.
Well, haven't been here when we had excess capacity big time. When I first came to the district, we had an awful lot of excess capacity, and we weren't being able to receive the full benefit of debt reimbursement, both the 60 or 70%. We couldn't get it because we had too much capacity. So, we made a major effort of reducing capacity. And first thing the district did was basically turn over all the swimming pools to the municipality. That cut down the amount of square footage that we had to account for. And so the deed formula was more favorable to us in that particular aspect. So if we ever get back to debt reimbursement, unless deed changes the formula, we're still going to have the same problem. Okay, we're not gonna get the full net reimbursement.
George, it's still gonna affect us. What we're seeing right now, and I've seen from my counterparts up at Deed, is debt reimbursement probably not coming back. The new mechanism for that is through these legislative, because Deed already has a process for providing for schools, and it works a lot better for them because these are completed projects. These are scored projects, they can prioritize them. But what factors into that is how much capacity you have available, how much extra capacity. So if you have a bunch of extra capacity, you're not going to score as well. And you'll get less funding that way.
Okay, so this is the question that's in my mind is how, could somebody tell me how capacity is determined? It's not based
Square
on,
footage.
so it's based on square footage. It's not based on, and we have our PTRs, we can have 25 kids in a classroom, or we can have 30 kids in a classroom. There are 17 classrooms at school X, but if you're telling me that it's a square footage and has nothing to do.
Your gyms count, your hallways count, everything. When you want reimbursement, now you can build whatever you want when you want to go 100%,
Mhm.
as long as you're to the specs of safety. But when you want the state to give you money back for reimbursement, you follow the rules in their building codes, which is very specific about how much space a school should be. And really, it came about, they had things like rows, because think about it, what was happening in a lot of Alaska was schools were being built in communities to like 10 miles outside of town, so a road could go to that thing. Like, think about, just the state of Alaska in general. So they were putting all kinds of things in schools, like to have school debt reimbursement paid for. So just over time, if you can imagine how the formula has now very specific that bond money to build schools is for children in schools. And so they do have square footage allowable. Now the square footage adjusts. There are some special education things. They do have some specs for different use, but it is really like the whole picture of a school to begin with. And so you want to put an extra gym in, that is part of your money for classrooms too. It's a bigger picture of it, but there's reason behind in research why it became so detailed in the state of Alaska. Like literally the road to the school cannot be paid for by a school bond. That is a city bond, that's a road. So they put a big dividing line because our state funding formula again is bifurcated in that operations and capital are very separate. And that's why we bond for major maintenance. When people go, why don't you pay for that yourself? Just like it's like actually it was designed in that manner back when we set it up.
Yeah, and the offset of the issue of the capital has to do with the operating budget, because the larger the school, the less you get per student. And that's where you got to the issue of you combine them, you have a save provision, but that save provision is temporary, right? It's over a certain period of time to allow you to do that. But if you have smaller schools, you as opposed to combining schools, you look at Eagle River, Chugach come together at one point because of other issues where we can move kids around, and then we looked at the economics, and you end up, getting less per student. And so you impact your operational funds that way if you expand it. So the smaller schools pay, you collect more for operational expense, and it's something that needs to be weighed into it too.
It's the
long-term.
450 and 1100 at high school. So high schools over 1100, it starts to decline, and elementary schools at 450, which is a pretty good size school.
It's a pretty good school, but I'm just saying though, that there's another factor just to at least consider when looking at combining schools, because that's what's impacting us in our decision making at that point.
But since the legislation, it actually is beneficial.
Yeah,
Because
They've
of
got a
the
safe
whole
pay
house.
provision, but the safe pay is not. forever.
It works out after the 5 years. It works out in the efficiencies of not having to put capital money into it.
On the average, just so you all know, it's about 114 square feet per student. Slightly less for elementary, slightly more for high school.
Makes us sound like chickens.
So when you talk to people in the community, when I talk to them and we talk about, under capacity schools, and, we do have the funding formula, which kind of penalizes you for larger schools, but where you really do save if if it's a school that really needs a significant amount of money, is that long-term capital that you no longer have to spend on that school. And now you can narrow your focus on a few less schools on your capital and other major maintenance needs. When we had, I'm drawing a blank, Shannon Bingham? Shannon Bingham was here, and he went through a large calculation and looked at the efficiencies you gain. And when you look at everything from planning time teachers and music teachers that don't have to go to 4 different schools, that now you really do start absorbing some staff and you can reallocate them in a classroom instead of other places. So I mean, you can look at it 50 different ways, but certainly for long-term capital requirements for a school that needs significant amounts of effort, if it's at 40% or 37%, it is a legitimate discussion, at least, to consider closing it.
May I just add to that? And I learned when we testified, because Jim did the analysis, and the reason that we wanted that legislation is because it actually costs money to close the school as well. And Jim had some data that he shared with the legislature that that's why we got that full-time list, because they would still pay for your students as that school being open and then ratchet it down. And that was to assist in taking the difference before that future could kick in. And I forget.
And that's how we got the 5-year whole time list approved, was showing them how to make the math work to where over the course of 5 years, you can capitalize on efficiencies of staff. You obviously reduced initial staff, depending on the school. You know, really you're talking 5 to 10 people tops. And it's that core office, administration, custodial nurse, those folks. But you're still paying full utilities that first couple of years as you figure out what you're going to do. There's just a lot that goes into why we had to have a whole time list to close the school to make it affordable. And it, you know, Annie and I, we have done the math, and it really kind of works out over the course of several years if you can gain those efficiencies, which you do, because you know, our elementary PE teachers, Ignite teachers, I mean, all these folks who drive around the district to lots of different schools, it ends up coming back, music, all of those.
Member Higgins had a question.
I recall the legislature passing an act that basically assured that charter schools could use excess space as well, and how well we reach out for that aspect is something I think that has to also be considered in regards to this, because there are a number of different charter schools with less than ideal space. Now, of course, some of the charter schools say, well, we just want to take over the whole school type of thing. And in some cases, that might be okay. That's kind of like a Montessori kind of thing. It kind of expanded to the whole school. But that's a consideration I would hope that gets weighed in on this whole discussion of how that space can be used for the students that aren't part of charter schools out there, and how well we integrate them or bring them into the system. Because some of them want to be separate, some of them don't want to be involved, others want to take it over the whole school. But a good discussion on that issue, I would hope to be a factor before we consider closing it.
It has been.
I think you can assume that would be a wide open discussion in the community and with the board, as well as other things like a pre-K academy or other centralized things where you don't have all these assets spread all across the district, and maybe you can focus them and have fewer requirements and centralized locations. And I think over the next, really between now and January, we're going to have a lot of discussions.
I realize that.
I have a question, and then I see 2 other participants have questions. This is a follow-up maybe for Tom. You said that you don't think that reimbursement is coming back. And that's sort of a scary proposition. It's $100 million in major maintenance for things that we've already paid for statewide. I mean, ASD, our needs are $100 million in and of itself. I mean, that's
We have 850 plus million
Right, I mean,
dollars for
our-
deferred maintenance.
Right, our
right now.
deferred maintenance needs are not going to be met on an annual diet of 100 million major maintenance
You know,
statewide.
I know what Deed says, and that's what Tom, we missed getting bond debt reimbursement reinstated by like 2 votes. Maybe 3. We have a November election where, you know, I mean, our Senate and House only have majorities of 1. It doesn't take a lot to shift those discussions from with the current legislature now, because you needed just a bit more. But you know, depending on how November turns out, then that changes the dynamics of what Deed and everyone else thinks may happen in the future. I mean, Representative Drummond, it was close. It's just when it got towards the end of the session, they had to get they weren't going to go past 18 May, and that and many other bills that really were close just fell off the plate, just so they could finish by midnight on the 18th.
Hold on.
President Bellamy was first, and then
Okay.
Member Jacobs.
Right, President Bellamy?
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments, Madam Chair, relative to the bond. You know, what kept coming back to me was its size. So I agree, it was too big. And I think we knew that as a board. We knew that we were at least not accepting the administration's recommendation. But for some reason, we thought otherwise. So, but it was too big. That's that I get coming back over and over again. And the whole idea of there being space or the perception that there is extra space in our buildings, or we are somehow not closing and or repurposing our buildings, using the space in a wise way. So we're talking around the fact that at some point in the future, we are going to have to look at how to I'm not saying close, but maybe repurpose our space so that so that we really appear to be trying to deal with the new norm, which is we're losing kids. And if we are going to continue to, for its day, the Picus Odin report was groundbreaking, actually, for me anyway, as an educator. But right now, I just think if we're going to, that was based on, I think, 50,000 kids, and that came out in 2015. I think that study was done in the district. I think we're at a point in our leadership that we probably need to look to do a different kind of report or an updated report if we are going to continue to compare what that report said and did from years ago until now. Things are very different now. And I am encouraged by the economics presentation that we had. And I am glad to see that some of that was incorporated in our last monitoring report. So with that, I'll just I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Bellamy. Member Jacobs, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I actually wanted to say just a couple quick things. I agree with Mr. Anderson's assessment. We've got 59 out of 60 seats in the legislature up, using new legislative districts and a new statewide election system for ballots. We don't know what's going to happen and who's going to be taking their seats in January. And so I think there's every reason for optimism, or at least kind of an approach of waiting and seeing. I do want to thank Representative Drummond for her work and pushing to reinstate bond debt reimbursement. I think if that work had begun earlier in session, I think that's one of the many things that could have flipped the 49-51 vote the other way. I do hear that we have a number of different conversations that need to happen. And so I think my question as we wrap up today is, what are next steps in terms of continuing to discuss the bond as well as the lingering space issue and conversation that needs to be had as well, I guess. So that's what next steps are my question to the group.
Yeah,
Yeah, and Member Higgins brought up a great point I want to touch on, also touched on by President Bellamy. There has been some thought, there's a school of thought about, in the event that we talk about repurposing buildings, just to add one or two more details here. There are some groups that are in danger of being marginalized in charter schools like ANCCS, for instance, that to the point they are ASD students, and more importantly, they are Anchorage, members of the Anchorage community. And if we're repurposing buildings, perhaps the narrative that we can craft is really more of an enterprise solution in the community sense. If we were to reallocate the population of a school, let's say at 52% capacity, let's say it's an elementary school, and we were to move, say, ANCCS into that program, the benefit to the district is that the utilities and ongoing maintenance are paid by that charter school. So we're not paying to maintain a school in, as we say, warm storage, but the charter school that occupies that building doesn't have to pay rent. They would have to pay, which in the case of ANCCS in the past, as we all know, was $50,000 to $60,000 a month. So everybody wins, but we also have this message of inclusion. So it is possible that we can craft a narrative if it comes to this discussion, and I think it will, in a positive way, maybe get ahead of this. Just appreciate the time.
I had one follow-up question. It's my understanding that the board about a year and a half ago, maybe a little bit longer before 4 of us joined the board, approved a plan to redraw school boundary lines. Does this strike?
That is correct.
And I believe it was for fall of 2022. And I haven't seen or heard that come up in discussion, but it was in a memorandum and it was approved. And I just wonder how that school boundary line, it was like a once a decade process, how that is going to inform the narrative of an enterprise solution, to borrow your language. Because I think President Bellamy, to your point, you know, how are we doing the perception of space and buildings? To me, procedurally, it seems like we need to do our due diligence and follow up on that prior board intent as part of that sort of this grand reimagining, if you will, of how we're going to show the public that we're using spaces efficiently, effectively. Yeah, Mr. Kalis.
So you're absolutely right. The thing with this, though, one of the reasons that the district kind of held back is we still have, even if you did reboundary, you're still going to have an issue with capacity.
Because we're still 5,000 kids
Yes.
less.
So what really needs to happen, you need to look at both of them at the same time. Because I Mr. Higgins, I think you've been through one, but boundary redrawing of boundaries is so emotional. You don't want to do it too many times. And so it would seem that maybe a better holistic look at it is, all right, if we're going to repurpose schools, which schools are more likely to be repurposed? What would we do? Are there schools that we actually have to close? There may be one or two, because when you look at how much capital it will take to bring those schools up to speed, it may be economically more feasible to close. Who knows? But what I'm saying is, all of that needs to be looked at. Once you've looked at that, then you go through the reboundary process. You don't want to do a reboundary, then decide that you're going to repurpose schools, close schools, go through a reboundary again. It's too painful for the public and for you all.
So you suggest a sequential.
I think so, yeah.
You're going to be seeing a board approved. We have it's housekeeping on boundaries because, you know, the last time we did this was quite a while ago. We've had new developments and those developments end up splitting a boundary. So transportation has already gone through, made these adjustments. so there's no big controversy around them. But there's the official practice of saying, yeah, if you enter your name into the system, that you're going to this school. So you'll be seeing that in the fall. That doesn't include any major moves. It's mainly just updating our boundaries in accordance with our practice right now. And I think another thing, just to put it in perspective, and how Deed looks at us. Normally, our goal is to fill our buildings to 90% of their capacity. Right now, Deed looks at us in the aggregate. And in the aggregate, we have 1 million square feet of excess capacity. And that goes back to how they look at projects and scoring those projects or reimbursement. And if we continue at our enrollment trend over the next 3 years, we'll be looking at 2 million square feet of excess capacity. So it's an issue that we need to address.
And those transportation boundaries that Tom just talked about, the kids are already going to the new schools. They have that. This is just cleaning up the boundaries so that when they post every year, you know, if you live in this particular area, this is the school you're going to, so parents know. So the kids have already been transporting, they've already been transporting kids to appropriate schools. Anyway.
Yeah, not the same context.
Yeah.
Actually.
It's just cleaning up the boundary. It has nothing to do with reboundary.
Okay, so if a person has bought a house on this corner, at this point in time, it's not going, what you're saying is that whatever is coming to the board in the fall is not going to say that that house is going to switch
The
from
kids are already going to the
one
school.
school to the next.
Yeah, they're already doing it.
So just be redrawing the map so you see that digitally. So that they don't get them wrong.
Okay.
I hope you think I remember when we looked at making boundary changes on base, and the number of people there, I'm just glad they didn't come in full comeback here, because it seemed like they were that type of approach. It's extremely emotional, and I can tell you it's hot. That's without closing a school. With closing a school, they probably would have come back here, I think, but it would be tougher driving home. You want to go a different way every day. It's very emotional. And so the question also raised is there some way to repurpose part of the schools for administration purposes versus some of the other places we've got to do something like that? Anything else? Because closing the local schools has a lot of connection with the community. It's a big emotional issue. There's an identity, there's an association. It's going to be very disruptive to do that. If there are, I just want to look at every option before we get to that big of controversial type of upsetting from the educational standpoint. The parents are going to look at that as very disruptive. We got so many in every school, people opting to go to different schools versus staying in the school they're at. Okay, so the boundaries, it's transportation only because they're all over the place. And it limits them because some people with the boundary changes can afford the transportation to drop them off, and others can't. And so I don't know how many would be in the district for Denali, Montessori, because almost all of them are coming in from different locations. It wouldn't even reflect the population of that area at all. So I just look at the numbers. I remember Inlet View had a higher number than what it leaving. They had more people coming than leaving, and people said if we changed the boundaries, it wouldn't have made a difference because of the numbers coming in was the difference. So I just want to play it all out that I'm all the options when we look at that issue.
I think another thing needs to be considered is that if you look at the types of schools we have, and you look at your Title I versus the other schools, there's going to be a tendency to say, well, really, we need to close these Title I schools. And the reason for that, of course, is that in some of the Title I schools, the capacity far exceeds the population going to. But then you have the perception issue of a Title I school, and the folks that can afford it to live, the least, having to transport the kids to some other out-of-bound area. So these are all things that the district has to look at. We discussed it internally about how to do this fairly and comprehensively. So those are all things that's being considered, but it's not easy. And Mr. Higgins, we did have several boundary changes before you came on the board, and those are the ones I'm referring to because they were significant and they were painful.
Yeah, I'm sure they were painful.
we're over time.
Okay.
Mr. Anderson had maybe.
So I just
last
have
question.
one last closing. I think about 25 minutes ago, Carl asked a question about what's the way ahead.
Yeah.
So the chiefs and I have talked about the way ahead a lot, and we are going to look at closing schools, rebounding. We know that we're going to have public awareness of the things that we're talking about very early in the August, September timeframe. But we did want to wait for Dr. Bryant to get on board because we see this as not something where the administration comes in and sends out a survey. There's going to have to be probably monthly discussions about this is what we think the fiscal cliff is going to look like. These are the options that we're looking at. Start getting feedback. There will be surveys naturally, and then start slowly rolling out the very clear path that we're leading down, so there are no surprises in February when the budget is posted online, and everyone will see this developing in public. We think that obviously, Dr. Bryant has been here for 9 days, but he's not aware of everything yet. So we're going to at least another 9 days with him. But we're going to be working on this all summer, and in August, we're going to be ready to sit down and have those discussions. And it's going to be a lot like what you and I talked about last fall. This time, we're looking at multiple things. And when you're looking at school repurposing, or school closures and wipe them clean, if that were to be one of the options. All of those kind of things, we can't surprise the public in February. It's got to be. And at the same time, what I also know is part of the likely outcomes, as we build this, the board members need to know, and we need to be talking to legislators all winter long, because in February, when we build our budget, it's based off statute. It's the $30 increase to the BSA. It's the one-time money from the $57 million they put towards education. And I don't know that anyone thinks the war in Ukraine is going to end real quickly, or that the price of oil is going to plummet overnight. And the worst thing is for us not to do it publicly, but we're going to have to really be careful in our assumptions, because we could come up with a budget in February based off statute. If we haven't kept in touch with the legislature from pretty much the week after the election gets certified up until then, we would be putting potential pink slips when you're looking at $50 million, 50 plus as a fiscal cliff, only to have one-time funding come back and everyone would say, well, why did you do that? So we have to prepare ourselves for that reality, that it's the month of February, we're making decisions knowing that the legislature's got 4 months to make a decision as to how to make it look like we didn't have a crystal ball. So I think there's going to be board member discussions, there's going to be community discussions, and the last thing we can afford to do is surprise anyone. And that's what the chiefs have been talking about. But we just wanted to wait till he'd been here for a full 2 weeks to ask for his thoughts. But that's, Carl, that's the best answer I can give you to the question you asked.
All right. I think that I'm going to call time here. We're a little bit over. We do have a finance committee meeting scheduled for June 14th. I'm looking forward to the conversations we can have over the coming year, and I sincerely appreciate everyone's participation and insights this afternoon. So thank you. Okay. Oh, I need a motion to adjourn.
Okay, I move to adjourn.
I'll
right.
second.
Thank you, the members Higgins and Wilson. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.